one of the really lovely moments in your book, which, as you say, because it just came out, as when you write a book, you're always sending it out and not knowing
Yes.
how it will be received,
Mm-hmm.
that you'll be happy if it prompts even a couple of people to read the Song of Songs.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you could tell us what it is about the Song of Songs that makes you want to send your readers into that space.
Oh, it's just so intriguing, and the story alone of why on earth it wound up in the Hebrew Bible and then in the Christian Bible it's so improbable, and then how it's interpreted and how that text just becomes a kind of resource text for all of these multiple layers of interpretation. It's just like a really great track, that people will go back to and rework and make something of. And also it's so unclear what's going on. It's not one song, it's a series of different verses kind of cobbled together. And it's peculiar because it's a nuptial poem. There is sexual congress happening between the young woman, the Shulamite, and a young man who I don't believe his name. Is he
No,
named?
he
I
doesn't
don't
have a
believe
name.
he's named.
Yeah.
And but she is the kind of leading voice, which itself is interesting. So there's a female voice, which is the leading voice, and there are references to the mother's house, but there's no references to the father, or any kind of anything paternal, and or even God, really. So, and then the beauty of it is also that it's often been interpreted, or people that think they know it see it as just a poem that's about sex, and it's not. There are much more sexually explicit love nuptial poems from that part of the world. There's one that I used to know, which was I think a Mesopotamian nuptial poem, which had the line, "Plow my vulva, my love." It's a line that's pretty direct, pretty straightforward. But in the Song of Songs, everything is redirected in a language of agrarian simile. Your belly is like a stag of wheat. Your hair is like a flock of goats coming down Mount Gilead. And so it's the eroticism, but then the indirection of the eroticism, which interests me. It's not a direct. It's not explicit.
Mm-hmm.
There's a restraint in it, which makes it even more beautiful. And then how that, in the case of the way I pick it up in the book, obviously Bernard of Clairvaux is writes however many sermons, 83 sermons on the Song of Songs, and gets to verse to stand, it doesn't get very far. And but that then provides the template for these female mystics who kind of come out of nowhere and develop this new form of discourse, and the Song of Songs is all over the place. So there's something about it which draws people in. And in an age of ever greater biblical illiteracy, I guess there's a slight plea for that just to read that, and not to interpret it in an obvious way that this is some kind of repressed sexual urge. No, this is there is sexual congress happening, and it's dealt with in this poetic, indirect, deflected way, which makes it all the more erotic and powerful.
I found myself thinking of also how it's sensual in the way that it's sort of attuned to like the smell of cedar or the smell of myrrh and
Yeah.
I actually can't. I don't know what myrrh smells like. I have perhaps some dim memories of some incense from some while carrying a thurible as an altar boy. But even then, in some of these translations, and I think of the really, really good one that is it Ariel and Chana Bloch did together when they were
they're
married.
a married
yeah.
couple.
Yeah,
That's a beautiful translation.
Yeah, which is just stunning, but that it sort of conjures this world that is on the one hand of objects, right? That is alien
Hmm.
in some ways, but also insofar as it's being not just sort of appercepted, I guess we could say, but just
Mm.
luxuriated in by these very embodied sort of modalities of perception. It
Yeah.
it made me think of what you do with Julian of Norwich as well, right? Where there are these like the herring or the different colors of garments or just
Yes.
this kind of the way that we're
It's so tactile.
yeah,
I
that's
think that's
and
the word you're
vivid in this
looking
way,
for.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very luxuriating book. There's lots of the luxuriations. Yeah, I'm very much pro luxuriation when it comes to mysticism. Sorry,
Well,
Abby.
I think I was
No.
going to say I remember reading Bernard of Clairvaux on the Song of Songs. I must have been 20 or something like that. And it was a particular cultural moment where being in college at that time when everything was deconstruction. Which I mean, and no disrespect, but it was like I was studying Derrida in one class and then studying Bernard of Clairvaux, and I was kind of like, oh, close reading is a lot older than I thought,
Yes.
and just like
Yes.
Bernard of Clairvaux's sermons on the Song of Songs are, so much of your book is about the palimpsest
Mhm.
of commentary and commentary on commentary. And it's not even that the Song of Songs is at the base of it, right? Because it's not
Mhm.
about looking for a particular origin. But there's something that strikes me as so similar to what Patrick and I do on this show in valorizing the kind of inexhaustibility of language that we see as something that arises from the Freudian project and what you
Mhm.
can get with this sort of approach of a Bernard of Clairvaux where, every word is so saturated, oversaturated with meaning.
Yeah.
And that, I think it's
a tradition of oversaturation.
exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. The texts are palimpsests. They are written and overwritten, copied, recopied, circulated. Yeah. It's the luxuriation. There are different ways of approaching mysticism, and there tends to be, I think, a tendency towards, it's a bit like yogurt, people like thin yogurt, low cal yogurt and so on and so forth. But I want the thick milky goodness. I want that. And so the person that I was teaching this class, this book didn't begin just as a course. It's not at all, but it also happened to be a course. And Eugene Thacker, who I was teaching with, tends towards the less luxuriating side of things. So that made me more about luxuriation and saturation and color and sensuousness. So I think I say at a certain point that I want the reader to luxuriate in Julian of Norwich's luxuriations, and to and that to be it's the sensuous aspect of mystical practice, which is, I think, the most shocking for the people that are largely uninformed about religion. They think it's just some kind of business of transcendence, or it's a negative theology which is about nothing more than a kind of linguistic operation. Or again, going back to what you were saying, Abby, about Derrida, much as I loved the guy, there was something, there was at times, at least what that produced in academia was a kind of linguistification which cut out things like sensuousness and materiality and so on and so forth. And we need something else apart from that. And close reading certainly didn't begin with Jacques D.
listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am delighted to introduce Simon Critchley. Simon Critchley is Hans Jonas Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York and a director of the Onassis Foundation. His books include Very Little, Almost Nothing from 1997, Infinitely Demanding, 2007, The Book of Dead Philosophers, 2009, and The Faith of the Faithless, 2012. He has also written a novella, Memory Theater, 2015, a book-length essay, Notes on Suicide, 2020, and studies of David Bowie, football, and Appleidiger, 2020. More recent books are Tragedy, The Greeks and Us, 2019, and Bald, 2021. Simon was series moderator of The Stone, a philosophy column in the New York Times, and co-editor of 3 volumes connected to the series. Most recently, Question Everything, 2022. He is 50% of an obscure musical combo called Critchley and Simmons, whose new album, Gone Forever, is released in 2024. Mysticism, the Experience of Ecstasy, which is what we're talking about today, was published by the New York Review of Books and Profile in November 2024. A short book on tragedy called I Want to Die, I Hate My Life will be published in 2025 with Eris. Simon, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for making the time to chat with us today.
Thank you very much, Abby. It's very nice to be here. And Patrick.
Delighted to have you.
We are excited to talk about the new book on mysticism. And I want to ask you a little bit about its origins and its connection to your previous work, because at first glance, I suspect that readers familiar with your body of work as philosopher and critic might think that writing about mysticism is a real departure for you. So can you tell us a bit about the origins of this project, how it took shape, and how you see it as connecting or disconnecting from your previous body of work?
Yeah, it is a departure. I mean, it is a departure and it isn't, but I want it to appear as a departure. I want it to appear like a disconnection from what I've done before. That pleases me. I like to go off in my work in not in a line the way you're meant to do, certainly academically. You do one thing and then you keep on doing it. And I like to go off in right angles and to finish something which I've been working on for years and years and years, and then to go off in another direction. So, and indeed, in your bio, there's an absurd little book called I Want to Die, I Hate My Life coming out, which of course is an antidote to mysticism. So I enjoy contradicting myself. That's for sure. And I like to keep it fresh and interesting in that way. So it is a departure. It's a shift also in very clearly in my relationship to religion, and that's a big part of things. It's it's a continuation of my ongoing war with academic philosophy.
That was clear.
Which is,
yes.
Yeah, which is perhaps of more interest to me than it is to other people. I'm not sure who I'm fighting with most of the time, and it's but it is a shift, and it's also a book which is it's trying to revive, foreground a different tradition, a mystical tradition, which has been certainly in a subject like philosophy, and certainly in the kind of the largely secular world of places like New York City tends to get treated risibly as a sort of a laughing matter, and so it's an attempt to really to get back to that, and also a lot of the book is taking a real delight in something almost reactionary. There's a reactionary focus on Christianity, trying to bring out the weirdness and strangeness of Christianity, and of course that always invites these questions, which are, well, you didn't deal with this, that, or the other, as if I'm ignorant of that. I'm not ignorant of other traditions, but at this point on this book, I'm not writing about them, and I'm incompetent to write about many of them. To really focus on the sheer strangeness of Christianity as what is still this faith that 1.5 billion people, however many it is, claim to believe in, and how strange its central doctrines are, and to rub people's faces in that a little bit, and then to line up a different group of characters. So there's a lot of the. It's also a tradition or a canon which is dominated by female authors, and the scholarship on it is also dominated by female authors. So there's a lot of hand wringing in academia and in philosophy about women in the canon, and a lot of that is justified. But here is this whole tradition of thinking which has been defined by female authors and written about by female authors. So if you're really concerned about that, well, why not deal with this? I mean, so it is a departure. It is something new. There's a shift in my relationship to theism and to religion and ritual and contradiction and all sorts of stuff. But of course, it goes further back. And I've touched on these. I read some of these texts a good long time ago. And then I developed quite slowly a class with a friend of mine, Eugene Thacker, on mysticism. And the thing why that's important is not that it's not in any way a book of a class at all, because we had a lot of guest speakers who also make appearances in the book, Caroline Bynum notably. And what was striking about these texts, teaching these texts, these very difficult, elusive, complex, and quite often quite short texts, was students wanted to read them closely, carefully, attentively, in a scholarly way. And what those texts were finding in those students was something intensely personal and potentially transformative. So it was a very different teaching experience than I've had before. So that's sort of why I wrote the book, was that I realized that this material really is dynamite, which you can put into people's hands and they can let it explode by themselves, and then they find some way of expressing that, articulate it, bringing that together with what is closest to them and most important to them. And then they were off on their own, doing their own projects, loosely based on some things that they'd read. But so it's a mixture of the intensely scholarly, fastidiously philological on the one hand, and the intensely affective and personal on the other. And that's a rare combination, certainly in my experience.
I find myself envying your students and also having again, flashbacks to my own experience as an undergrad and then as a graduate student, encountering texts that emerged from or that are associated with the Roman Catholic tradition in which I've been brought up and which I no longer am affiliated with, but being so struck by their sort of, I don't want to say like wildness, but the way that they made this tradition that I thought I understood and which was experienced for me in terms of very given logics of gendered hierarchy and of how you relate to the body and to its pleasures, most notably, rendering it entirely uncanny, and even like transgressively distressing, and coming across, whether it's
good.
Yeah, it was great. It really it was wild to I think see that statue of Teresa of Avila by Bernini and being like, oh my God, that is what that is, right? She's getting off in that statue, right? Or thinking of like a text like the Book of Marjorie Kemp, which I just adore, and how it was so incredibly alien, and yet, because she's she's constantly weeping, and she refers to herself as the creature, and it just reads like a straight, almost, I'm trying to think of a novel that it would like something like Faulkner, where the narrator has been afflicted by some sort of cognitive or psychological injury, who knows what, but that still it would have these moments of incredible humor. Yeah, I think I want the scene where she's walking. I think when she's on a pilgrimage or something with her husband, who is starting to have second thoughts about the whole vow of chastity thing, and he's had a little too much beer, and
That's right.
and finally he gets so angry, he makes an advance at her, and she rejects him by weeping, as she constantly does, and then he just drinks a little bit
Yeah.
more of the beer from their failing brewery business and goes and lays down in a ditch, and I'm like, this is hilarious. But then also just like this, the intensity of experience and of non-normative experience that
Mhm.
was finding its way in these texts just cut across how I understood historical periodization, how I understood
Yes.
canonicity, and then also how I understood these very ostensibly given categories of like what you could say in a religious context, or
Mm,
or how
mhm.
people were supposed to behave in religious spaces, right? It was
Mhm.
it wasn't. I presume my reaction wasn't quite the same as, I don't know, the way Marjorie would scandalize nuns by just weeping floridly in church. But on like an epistemological level, I was like, wow, this is happening, and it's provoking something in me, and I'm not sure what. And I wanted just to go deeper. And so again, it's also to say that your book was very appreciated on that front, because it allowed for that to happen.
Well, it is wild. It's wild stuff. It really is. I don't know. And in relation to historical periodization, I guess I don't really buy it. I think I said one event. I don't think it was recorded, so I suppose it doesn't matter. But somebody asked me a question. I think I said "fuck history" at a certain point, which just felt really good. I'm not. I don't agree with your neat sequence of periods. I don't think there's anything ancient about the ancient. There's anything medieval about the medieval. I think these things, these are fictions which have been constructed quite recently, and they divide up the past in very neat sequenced ways. And then we're meant to be in, you know, secular modernity, and that means that we can't believe X, Y, and Z. And I just don't buy that. It doesn't resonate with people's actual experience, for a start. And so there's a delight that I take in messing with any kind of historical periods or anything. We can talk about, well, this was back then, and I just don't think, obviously things have changed since the time of Marjorie Kemp, which we could talk about or not, but who she is, what she's about, that's still around, that still resonates, and we've all met Marjories, and I don't know how much time we'd like to spend with them. I mean, she, roaring in church. Imagine going for a, Christmas carol service, and there she is weeping and roaring. Marjorie, please just keep it down. Please, not again. And then the
Oh.
husband, yeah, after 14 children. 14 children. And her adventure begins at the age of 40. So I think there's another trope about mysticism, insofar as that resonates out there in the popular imagination, that these are mystics are young girls
Mhm.
who see the Virgin Mary, and then along comes a priest to test whether this is valid or not, and we have that idea of the mystic, the sort of Sound of Music version of it. And whereas, Marjorie was 40 and she'd led a whole life. And at 40 in that period was late middle age.
Mhm.
And she'd made it, and, had 14 kids. I don't know how many of them have died. A whole bunch of them had died. And off she goes around the world. And she really goes around the world. And Julian too, Julian of Norwich, the kind of heroine of the book. It's at 30 and a half, as she says. Very nice detail, 30 and a half. And although we know nothing about her, it's hard to imagine something must have happened to her in those first 30 years. She must have lived, and then there's a transformation. So this is maybe, the upbeat, self-help message of the book for those people of a certain age. This might happen to you. You might get to a certain stage in your life, and you might think, "Oh, it's over for me." No, you could be, Marjorie was 40, so 50's the new 40 or whatever it might be. This could happen, and off you would go on a pilgrimage. So, and there is something, transgressive and wild and untamed at the heart of that tradition, which we think we're familiar with, Christianity and Roman Catholicism, and and another kind of subtext in the book, which isn't there. It's not there, but it's unspoken subtext is that I have spent a good deal of time in Greece in the last 10 years and lived there for a couple of stretches, not for very long, and I've been to monasteries on Mount Athos and on 2 occasions, and I've learned about Orthodox Christianity, which has been a really interesting thing to find out about, because in the West we have this story of, Latin Christianity, the Catholic Church, and then the Reformation, and then wherever we are now, and it leaves out the whole Orthodox story, which was a tradition where there was no Reformation, and mysticism has always remained central to religious practice, and indeed, because of the fun historical fact, because of the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and the fact that the Orthodox Church is still under the aegis of the Patriarchate of Constantinople or Byzantium or Istanbul, but they have no power. The monks basically run the whole thing themselves, and so the monks are kind of in charge, and that's a tradition, and the Catholic Church has wrestled with mysticism with difficulty over the centuries. Something else, something more, I think, more sinister happens with Protestantism, and but so in a sense, the book, in different manifestations, different ways of thinking about the book, is a kind of return to orthodoxy in a strange way. And there's a character called David Bentley Hart, who I've quite recently, after the book was written, largely, I've been reading more of and rather interested in him, and the fact that what would it be to imagine a Christianity without St. Augustine, without the focus on sin, on original sin, and the idea that grace is obscure and distant, the elect are few, and you're almost certainly going to be damned. So Christianity, another weird thing about say Reformed Christianity in the United States, is that the Christians are, on the whole, let's say they're nice people. I don't know. Let's just, as a hypothesis, say they're nice people, Reformed Christians, but they still believe there's going to be 144,000 elect, and the rest of the people are damned, including many of their friends and family, maybe themselves. And that's a bizarre belief to hold, it seems to me. So David Bentley Hart has a lovely argument for universal salvation, a universal soteriology. And I think that's, I link that together with Julian's emphasis on all shall be well. And so there's that Orthodox subtext to the book as well, which is also very new for me.
Well, I want to do a little bit of definitional ground clearing, just because there's so many ways in which people have thought mysticism, and I'm not going to say yours is idiosyncratic, but it's distinctive, and I want to make sure we get that out on the table, especially because for many of our listeners who are, have various psychoanalytic commitments, I think
Right.
mysticism is going to first activate that, the famous passage in Civilization and Its Discontents, where Freud, continuing the conversation with Romain Rolland, that he's having kind of outside. He's written Future of an Illusion, this really bracing, let's say, critique of religion. And then he talks about, early on in Civilization and Its Discontents, he talks about the oceanic feeling, which he claims that he's never had, right? So there's, I think for many of our listeners, they might hear mysticism and immediately think mystification, think illusion, perhaps dangerous illusion.
Yes,
but
yes.
this isn't really what your book is about, and you stipulate quite plainly that mysticism is not a religion, but it's a tendency within religion. And as I think you've already alluded to, this has often been a problem for religious institutions, right? The mystical tendency. You also observe that this mystical tendency has had a vexed relationship with Western, let's just say Western philosophy, to paint with an extraordinarily broad brush, but I don't think it's wrong to say that. And so you write, quote, "For me, mysticism is a way of thinking about existential ecstasy that is outside and more than the conscious self," close quote. Can you walk our listeners through your working definition of mysticism in the book?
Well, the shortest version of it would be from another female author who was very famous and then has been rather forgotten, Evelyn Underhill, where she talks about mysticism as experience in its most intense form. I think that's the neatest, shortest way, experience in its most intense form, where you are held outside yourself, and ecstasy is that, being outside yourself, transported, an idea of transcendence, which is very much here and now. The transcendence that I feel when I'm walking around the world in a very matter of fact way. When I'm going about my day to day, there's an ecstasy there, an everyday ecstasy. In mysticism, there is a more accentuated, enervated ecstasy, but that's the basic thought. And with that, to abandon the idea of consciousness, which I'm very keen that we abandon and we'll come to psychoanalysis in a moment. But I'm very much with your friend and mine, everyone's friend, William James, in this book. And he writes a question. He writes an essay called "Does Consciousness Exist?" And the answer is no. Consciousness is just this name for something that's between the back of our nose and the top of our head. And the idea of in philosophers, but also this is filtered down into popular discourse, the hard problem of consciousness, the hard problem, the mystery of consciousness. It's just claptrap, it's bollocks. I mean, consciousness is easy, it's just awareness. There's no mystery to that. And the awareness that mysticism has is an awareness which is outside oneself, outside one's head, an awareness of things being there, present to one. And so, the hard problem is the problem of matter, not consciousness. But that's a separate podcast. So I think and then there are more complex ways of defining mysticism. Mysticism is organized around a set of practices of reading, prayer, meditation, composition, contemplation. Are they 5? Maybe they're 5. And those are the 5 that are listed by Hugh of St. Victor in the 12th century. So, and the thing that I'm very, very keen on is that mysticism is a practice, is a set of practices. It's not some belief in a transcendent being. It is a bundle of practices, and it's a performance as well. So the performative, practical dimension to mysticism is very important to the way I think it occurs. In the case of, say, Marjorie Kemp, she's certainly performing. She's acting out, and she's engaged in practices. So I think the whole question of mysticism is missed by approaching it as a theoretical issue. A theoretical issue which is reduced to, do you or do you not believe in the existence of some transcendent being? That is a complete misunderstanding, misrepresentation of the phenomenon of religious life, it seems to me. So there's that to kind of get to one side. Now, Freud, about whom I have all sorts of opinions, but for the purposes of this podcast, I'll try to satisfy myself with kind of, pissing off Freudians. I mean, yeah, I think Freud's work is very much in the wake of a whole set of modern assumptions, which I track to Luther and to Kant, which invite suspicion towards the mystical. They invite a kind of hostility to that, as you say, a leeriness towards that domain of illusion, which is religion. And that's Freud, and that makes sense. And Freud's a genius, and I used to teach classes on him before I came to New York, and now there are perfectly good psychoanalysts that can teach those classes. So I don't do it anymore, but he's very important to my work. But I think mysticism raises interesting questions to what we think of as psychoanalysis, and what I see as some of the theological dogmas of psychoanalysis. I think psychoanalysis and theology are related in the sense in which they both assume a set of presuppositions, and once you accept those presuppositions, then you can go off and interpret things in various ways. And I'm, for example, I'm interested in a. I recently refound in the back end of the summer. I was going through some old boxes and trying to put books on shelves, and the things that we sometimes do in the summer to organize things and to also go over the past. I was found these old emails from someone called François Rousting. François Rousting only met a couple of times through a psychoanalyst, philosopher friend of mine called Monique David-Ménard, who wrote wonderful work on hysteria after Freud and Lacan, and the madness in the history, madness in pure reason. Anyway, I met François through Monique, and François was someone who was, he'd been there as one of the key figures in Lacan's circle in Paris at the very beginning, alongside another figure that maybe we can come to in a little while, Michel de Certeau. And but Roustin had come to the view that psychoanalysis was based on a decision that Freud takes in, let's invent a date, 1895, something like that, to focus on language as the medium for the unconscious, and it's the material offered up by language that can be interpreted by the analyst, and if the analyst can transferentially work that through, can then produce a construction that will persuade the patient of a certain view of things which they are not fully aware of. So language becomes the medium. And what interested Roustin was hypnosis, and the fact that a decision that Freud took early on when he was experimenting with different things was that hypnosis could have been a different means of psychoanalytic technique. And
Freud was really bad at it. The whole history of psychoanalysis might be different had Freud had a talent for...
Right, if he was better at hypnosis. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And hypnosis was a kind of, for someone like Roustin, it put people into a situation of what he called, what the French call la veille, a kind of awareness which isn't fully conscious awareness, the feeling you have when you first wake up, something like that, where you can feel a proximity to things. And actually, the business of therapy in there becomes very different. It becomes visual. It becomes sensual in different ways. So I think there are paths in psychoanalysis that could be questioned. Freud's path could be questioned. Of course, there's the looming specter of Jung, right? And that kind of cleavage in the history of psychoanalysis between the Freudians and the Jungians. And the Jungians do really good business, which pisses off the Freudians, right? They're onto something with their red book. and I remember I was teaching at the University of Essex. We had a psychoanalysis center which started in the early 90s, and there were these very worthy Freudian and object relations people that used to get some students, and they were doing a good job. Great people. Joan Raphael left, top people, but they started a Jungian MA, and that got 4 times as many students. People would fly in from around the world to attend a seminar on Jung. And Jung is good business. So that is a diversion. The other figure who is a psychoanalytic fellow traveler and then, slightly distant to it at a certain point is Michel de Certeau, who was another member of Lacan's circle, who's a Jesuit priest and a psychoanalyst. And then he is a specialist on 17th century French religion. I use so in a sense, going back to the question you asked before, what is mysticism? Well, the word, the mystical, la mystique, is first used in the 17th century in French to describe a new form of experience, a certain passivity of experience, which had arisen after the Reformation. So mysticism is a modern category. That's another thing I left out of the early definition. So the concept of mysticism is an anachronism in the sense in which it's a modern notion, 17th century, but really it doesn't really kick into the 19th century, I don't think, as an operational notion. And mysticism then becomes this thing which is kind of separated out. There are these people having these mystical experiences, and then we back project that onto a tradition. We invent a tradition of mysticism, and which becomes a tradition of dangerous, marginal, heretical types who had these visions and who the church has always been trying to put down. And that's really not the whole story. Most of the people that I deal with in the book, the medievals, did not think of themselves as mystics because the word wasn't available. They thought of themselves as contemplatives or just as religious people. And nearly all of them, I can't think of one who thought of themselves as a heretic. They thought of themselves as people that were trying to hang on to the truth of Christianity as they saw it. If the church had to react to that either positively or negatively. So, there's a whole bunch of stuff. So maybe we could, revive forms of hypnosis, different types of therapeutic practice. It's certainly a thought, isn't it?
I want to ask you a little bit about the distinctive pantheon. I want to use the word pantheon, your personal pantheon of mystics that you sketch for your reader a bit about them early on in the book. These 16 mystics in the broadly Western Christian tradition, and I think we've gotten to a couple of the themes that guide perhaps some of these choices. But can you tell us about your selection of these figures and about your enthusiasm for Meister Eckhart and also Julian of Norwich, the heroine of your book in particular?
Yeah, I will. Yeah, for sure. There's a cast of characters I introduced at the beginning of the book called Brief Lives of 16 Mystics, because there's just some great stories, Christine the Astonishing, who, revives at her own funeral and then floats up to the ceiling and then lives in the wilderness and feeds herself from milk from her own breasts and throws herself into frozen rivers and boiling hot ovens and hangs herself from the gallows. So you've got these lives of the mystics that many of those were composed by by brother scribe,
Yeah.
by monks who were fascinated, perhaps titillated by these extraordinary stories. A more, fleshed out, complex picture is Angela of Foligno, who is a little bit like Marjorie. She's very, very noisy. She weeps a lot. But she also practices a lot of the book is concerned with practices of negation, of cutting away. But hers is very much a corporeal, what I call a corporeal apophaticism. She's trying to kind of cut her body away in order to enter the body of Christ, and that's really, really strange. It's like a horror movie. Really, she describes herself crawling into the side wound of Christ, the bloody side wound of Christ.
But I will never forget reading Angela Foligno's book for the first time, where she says, I'm going to misquote this, but it's something like, I will make your cross my bed.
That's right. That's right.
And you're really laying it all out there.
No, she wasn't messing around. Yeah. She's great. So there are some wild stories, and then you've got, then you've got the reversal of that, the standard gendered picture, where you've got someone like Henry of Suso, who writes this book called The Life of the Servant. This is in the 14th century. And this is the most widely circulated book in the German-speaking lands, apart from Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, so scholars say. And Suso's story is written down by his spiritual daughter, who's called Elsbeth Stagel. And so there you get a reversal of the standard brother scribe, noisy Angela version of things. Here is Henry Suso, who has a very strange relationship to his own gender, sees himself as female, sees Christ as female, and that story is told by a woman. And there are other great stories as well. Therese Rabelais levitating, Marjorie Kemp, we've gone over a little bit. And then, little ones that, less well-known ones, like Marie of the Incarnation, who I like, who was the first Canadian mystic. She winds up in Quebec City in 1630 and writes a series of interpretations of the Song of Songs. It's either her or Madame Guyon that comes up with I think it's Madame Guyon who says that God is all mouth. So you're saying the cross is my bed, God is all mouth. So what we have we have this idea of religion, or of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, take your pick, as some kind of cognitive, intellectual, at least something that's going on in your head, relationship to the divine, which you either hold or you don't hold, and that's called faith. But here, in figures like Guyon and many others, it's something that happens through the mouth. It's something, and that's why in female mystics there is this the central act of Christianity is Eucharistic devotion. Right? It's the eating of God and the imbibing of God, and the fact that the central medium for communicating with God is eaten, and it's blood, and there's blood everywhere. Which brings us to Julian of Norwich, who's my favoured mystic, the heroine of the book. And she, unlike Christine the Astonishing, Marjorie Kemp, and many of the other more extreme cases, Julian basically, spends her life in her anchor hold attached to the Church of St. Julian in Norwich. We don't know her name. We just know the name of the church to which she was attached, which you can still visit. And there's a Julian study centre next door. You can join it. I'm a member. Costs £20 a year. Excellent value. And Julian, at the age of 30 and a half, wishes for suffering. And she wishes for suffering that would be like the suffering of her Lord. She receives that gift of suffering. She describes it as a gift. And she dies. She begins to die. She's dying. She wants to die with Christ. And she is dying. She describes her body getting colder, her legs getting colder, her arms getting colder. And at that point, a priest is brought in, or a parson is brought in, and administers last rites. And then there's a boy with the parson who's holding a cross. And then, as at last rites are being administered, she begins to see that the crucifix begins to bleed. And that bleeding continues profusely and in different forms for 13 hours or so, and is accompanied by different showings. And and that lasts for that brief period of time, and then she interprets it for the next 30, 40 years. And that reveals a very interesting thing about mysticism, is that people often, if you say, oh, I'm working on mysticism, they say, oh, well, yeah, I had this experience when I was taking ayahuasca in, Guatemala, last year, and whatever. And we then reduce mysticism to some experience or experiences that, of being high or whatever that people have had. People are very keen on that. And that, again, is not it. For Julian, she has 12, 13 hours of showings. It happens in 2 bursts, and that's it. And then she spends the rest of her life trying to understand the meaning of those showings. And that involves her in a work of philosophy and theology, as well as, in a sense, being a part-time, counselor therapist for people that show up like Marjorie Kemp. So the mysticism is not reducible to experience. It requires concepts, and it's the concepts which I think produce new forms of experience. So that's a key point for me. So it's not that, we can't say that, if it's like with, say, Freud, he didn't have these experiences, and therefore we could describe them in a certain way, but they're not really valid. The issue with mysticism is bringing concepts to bear. People that have brought concepts to bear on experiences that have produced more experiences, which one can try and understand. And then coming to Eckhart, 1260 to 1328, Eckhart, who doesn't have visions. There are no visions in Meister Eckhart. There are no weird mystical experiences. He's a good boy. He's a good German boy. And he does his work, and he's master of theology at the University of Paris, not just once, but twice. The only equal to that was Thomas Aquinas. So he's a top scholar, writes these amazing commentaries on the Bible in Latin, and then he's sent off to do do work in the German-speaking lands, Strasbourg, Cologne, elsewhere, and he gives these sermons. And these sermons are wild, absolutely extraordinary texts, and he develops a kind of new theology, which is Christian for him, very clearly, but it's doing really weird things with Christian theology. And he comes to the attention of the authorities, a jealous bishop in Cologne, one imagines, because he's getting audiences. Another key thing about mysticism, I haven't said this yet, it's very important, is that mysticism draws a crowd, right? So mystics that we know of, that we have texts by, they survived because they attracted an audience, and they were popular and populist as well. There's a populism to mysticism, and that's also what invites the deep suspicion of secular academics, Orthodox Freudians, so on and so forth. These people sell books, draw attention, and that's still the case in the whole New Age spirituality, occult magic world, which, we can pretend doesn't exist, but God, it's huge. So mysticism draws a crowd. Eckhart drew a crowd, and that crowd led his bishop to report him to the authorities. The papacy was divided at that point between Rome and Avignon. He was sent to Avignon. He was investigated. He died there. And then a year after his death, he was condemned with a papal bull. And I think 18 or 19 of his propositions from his work were considered to be heretical. And he has a great riposte to that. Was he a heretic? Eckhart says, and I'm quoting, he says, I'm able to be in error, but I cannot be a heretic, for the first belongs to the intellect and the second to the will. So he admits that he could have been wrong, but he's not a heretic. His will is that of a Christian. So the idea of him being a heretic is ludicrous to him.
I got to find some way to use that line, updated to the contemporary moment for the next time I'm in a fight with someone on social media or in my personal life.
I mean, that or like Luther's "Here I Stand." I can, I cannot do otherwise. I think there's
right.
I understand that Luther is a little bit of a villain in this book, but that you can't deny that line.
He is a villain. Yeah, he is a. Yeah, did he know what he brought about? I don't know. I mean, he's also just an intensely fascinating figure, and another populist for sure.
Just like a man whose mystical experience involves sitting on a toilet might be something that we want to sort of think about in terms of anal sadism. But that's another podcast conversation as well.
Very scatological, Luther, right? And all those people, all those German early Reformation people, it was all about shit, wasn't it? It was all about, yeah.
Yeah, we got to do an episode on Young Man Luther.
Yeah, the Erickson one, yeah.
Yeah, the Erickson book.
Young Man Luther.
So Simon, something we both really loved about the book is your invocation of this classic Puritan proverb. I did not know this proverb before. God loveth adverbs.
Yes.
To document certain recurrent patterns of thought, rhetorical movements, conceptual turns, and more that characterize mysticism. And, as you might imagine, we were particularly interested in the ones that resonate with psychoanalytic preoccupation. So the oblique, the autobiographical, the erotic, and the ascetic, which had us thinking about questions of interpretation, alterity, jouissance, sublimation, and more. And, in conversations that we had in the week leading up to this conversation, as we were both reading your book, we both found ourselves taken with the notion of mysticism as involving a kind of struggle with the constraints of narcissistic selfhood.
Yes.
A rejection of melancholy and as a journey of self-transformation that's bound up ultimately with ideas of release, ecstasy, and love. So you write, for instance, quote, "From the outside, a released existence might look exactly like our ordinary everyday life. Nothing would change, and yet everything would change. If thinking could be detached and freed from the tyranny of the will and its endless strivings, then we would finally be open to that space where we live, move, and have our being, the world," close quote. So I'm hoping that we can spend the rest of our time today working through these themes, going in whichever direction you might want. But I will say that, the note that I have in the margins a bunch of times, and it's a note that I've, muttered to myself in the middle of the night on occasion, is like, the self is a problem, right?
Yes.
The self is a problem. And it seems as though this version of it's not even thinking, because it's also feeling. Mysticism, yes. So I'm trying to correct, or at least chip away at my academic tendency to be like, how do we think X, right? Because that's not the question here. But I am really interested in us getting to talk about something that is a psychoanalytic preoccupation, but that it is fundamentally, I think, almost in any way that you approach mysticism, at least within the confines of like the Christian mystical tradition here. Like, let me really be really clear that is what we're talking about. That we are not offering, and nobody here is offering like a universal or universalizing definition about the relationship to the self.
That's good. That's very, very helpful. The self is a problem. Maybe we can come back to that. And the dimension of feeling, yeah, I think that's, and I was watching this Brian Eno documentary, this generative documentary, which came out some months ago over the summer. And Eno, who plays a role in the book, was talking about how he used to think in terms of cognitive problems or epistemic issues or whatever. And for him, increasingly, everything is a matter of feeling. And I think that is the case. And certainly, I think, without wanting to make this in any way relevant, that's also incredibly important politically, feeling and getting feeling right and the conditions in which we get feeling wrong. And so there's that, the headline of the book, which is aimed at, it's aimed at psychoanalysis insofar as psychoanalysis is tributary to Shakespeare's Hamlet, which I take it as definitional. That it's not the Oedipus complex stupid; it's the Hamlet complex that's central. That's what Freud was working through. He just wanted to give it a Greek name or something like that, but it's really Hamlet. And Hamlet is the anti-mystic par excellence. He is the quintessential anti-mystic, and he uses language in order to ratiocinate in the most extraordinarily powerful ways. Right? He is the cleverest person who ever existed. It's true. And let's just imagine, for the purposes of argument, it's true. Hamlet is the smartest guy in the room. And he can doubt everything. He can double everything up. He can see everything from 6 or 7 different positions. And what that leads to in him is the extinction of the capacity for love, right? He's locked up in that soliloquizing, ego of smartness. And it kills the capacity for love, obviously for Ophelia in the play, who is the casualty of love, because of how she responds to the death of her father. Hamlet's response to the death of his father is just by talking a lot and not acting. Ophelia experiences profound grief and takes her life. Love for his mother and anybody else. Love for the world. The world is a sterile promontory. Man pleaseth not me, no, nor woman, neither. So there's a sense in which the book is constituted, mysticism is constituted against Hamletized melancholy. That's really important. And insofar as psychoanalysis has been in the melancholy business, it's against psychoanalysis too. And there was a lot more psychoanalysis in earlier drafts of some of this, and I almost studiously cut it out because I didn't want to give too many kind of, clues or red herrings. And so can we reject melancholy becomes the issue. And obviously for Freud, obviously there's ordinary unhappiness. There is, that's that maybe the best that we can have. There is mourning, which is when grief is worked through, you return to be able to have a relationship to a loved object. There's melancholy, where that goes wrong and it turns in on itself. And the example there is either Dostoevsky or Shakespeare's Hamlet. And then the alternative is mania, a kind of manic pushing aside of the ego. And I want to make the bizarre hypothesis that there is another way, which is that all shall be well, as Julian says, that all shall be well and all manner of thing shall be well. And we can push aside that weight of that heaviness, as Julian calls it, that heaviness of melancholy, and open ourselves to something else. It doesn't mean that the melancholy goes away. It doesn't mean that the sadness that clings to us no longer clings to us. We have to continue to go back through that. And that's what the experience of dereliction, distance from God, failure, sin, and the rest doing for the mystics. But there can be an opening. There can be something else, and that if there is an attempt at a shift of feeling, obviously the closest we get in psychoanalysis is sublimation, which as a reaching back into my brain, I think there's a lovely piece by Laplanche and Pontalis where they talk about sublimation is it Lacan who says this is the answer, but Freud doesn't tell us what it is. He leaves that blank. That essay in the metapsychological papers disappeared or whatever. So what would make up for an impossible happiness is sublimation. And what these characters are engaged in, these mystics, is in psychoanalytic terms a form of sublimation. And maybe we can. Maybe we need to think about it in different ways, and maybe we can find some other way through. I think it means getting outside our heads. There's a quote that I like, and maybe I could quote this if that might help your audience. It's a nice quote from Flannery O'Connor. This is from a prayer journal by Flannery O'Connor, written when she was very young, I think a student in Iowa. And she says, "Dear God, I cannot love thee the way I want to. You are the slim crescent of a moon that I see, and myself is the earth's shadow that keeps me from seeing all the moon. The crescent is very beautiful, and perhaps that is all one like I am should or could see. But what I'm afraid of, dear God, is that my self-shadow will grow so large that it blocks the whole moon, and that I will judge myself by the shadow that is nothing. I do not know you, God, because I am in the way. Please help me to push myself aside." That's it. I am in the way. Please help me to push myself aside. So mysticism is a practice which can help you push yourself aside. And that pushing yourself aside goes by different names. It's what Simone Weil calls decreation, the undoing of the creature in us. But could go by different, the annihilation of the soul in Marguerite Porete. We've not talked about her. I think I mentioned her, but it's fascinating. But we have to get that thing that is us out of the way, and to open in us a capacity for detachment, releasement. That's not some kind of Buddhistic detachment, but a detachment where we are there in the world. So if there's another subtext that's operating in the book, which isn't there in the book, but to be honest with you, is that I'm not a Nazi, but I'm a Heideggerian, and I have deep Heideggerian commitments, and it's complicated. But the basic point is that we don't we don't learn. What do we learn from the journey inwards? I don't know. I think we've convinced ourselves that we do, and I think what we find with these characters in the book is a different type of journey, which takes us outwards and elsewhere, and into a kind of ecstasy, which is, I think, was the main focus of what Heidegger was up to in his early work, and that does. I think there are ways of making different forms of therapy square with that. Heidegger was closer to people like Binswanger and Medard Boss, and that whole tradition of existential analysis, or indeed someone who's very close to my heart, R.D. Laing. I could talk about that. He also didn't make his way into the book, but he's very, very, very much in the background, Laing. And I find Lang's and Boss and Binswanger's, attempts to reshape psychoanalysis, reshape that Freudian landscape, are at least worth a try.
Yeah, I found myself in reading your book having a variety of sort of resonant connections with psychoanalytic thinkers, and sort of, broadly speaking, I have a kind of ecumenical. I think we try to foster a kind of ecumenical approach, but towards psychoanalysis. But also, I mean, I agree. I think we can probably read a lot of Freud's resistance to mysticism, though, there are attempts to find it in there by various scholars, as being very symptomatic of a variety of things, both dispositional, right? I mean, I think the closest he has to a mystical experience is that bit on the Acropolis, and that's really about his personal ambitions and family.
That's a very interesting moment, right? Very interesting moment.
It's great. And then also, too, there's the complicated question of how he relates to his father's sort of Judaism and his sort of contempt for his father, and then his odd relation to his mother, which he can't really sort of square with other things. And all that combined with, I guess, his understandable anti-clericalism in some ways, given sort of the legacy of Christian anti-Semitism, which, recurs so virulently in his own lifetime, and his desire to find some sort of cosmopolitan grounding in the rhetoric of science, or at least in a kind of scientism. So what all that sort of built to me was thinking of figures who were not Freudian, right? Or who would use the Freudian project, or whatever the sort of the worldview that Freud inaugurates, to try and push at other types of conceptual, but also practical, experiential kind of modalities of being in the world, but also of performing therapy. And where I found myself going in this was, on the one hand, to figures very concretely. I was thinking, actually, and I'm glad you brought up Heidegger here, figures like Lowald, right, who are students of
Heidegger.
Yeah,
and would be another way to go.
And who wants
on sublimation in particular.
And who was very, in a way that I find really moving and also appealing, because he's kind of like a Rainer Sherman figure, right? He's giving you all this stuff about Socrates and the sort of the Neoplatonic tradition, but he names the capacity that is necessary for good psychoanalytic care in the analyst as love, right? You have to love your patients, and that, or like, you have to bring them to a type of love, and that love is so interestingly related to some of the things we've already been talking about, namely sort of the way in which, for psychoanalysis more generally, but also for, I think, the particular type of work that goes into training analysis, involves a kind of both a evacuation of an inventory and an evacuation of your own sort of transferential and counter-transferential smallness, I guess, right?
So a sort of kenosis, if you will,
yeah.
a self-emptying.
Yeah, and that is
absolutely.
And that technically, in the analytic encounter, produces something that is, well, not just as, and I think this is another resonance with your book, an attunement to the way, to a vision of the person, let's call it the psyche, but that it goes above and beyond merely the conscious, right? And an ability to see and foster in the person that you're working with a encounter with their own self, in the mode of, well, there's something uncanny about you. There are things about you that are, you are another, right? In that kind of way. But also that on a technical level, the way that finds articulation, as the analyst has to develop a capacity for free floating attention, right?
Yeah,
to kind
I
of
flagged that too in the book. This shows up a lot.
Yeah, the old analytic apparatus, right? That kind of is the thing that allows you to not be reactive to what comes up, and what to not make it about you, such that you can then also not reduce it to what's going on with the person as you sort of want to pathologize or have them stuck in this moment, but rather open them onto new fields of possibility. And that in turn brought me, and this is the last thing I'll say, but to this sort of recurrent question, and which is something I think we come back to a lot on the show, and that people like to sort of talk about and to think about, psychoanalysis, if we want to see it in this way, as a process of personal transformation, and what, its ends are, if it's something other merely than just sort of psychic hygiene, right? Or something you go into to improve performance in some sort of kind of flattened ego psychology model, but instead is being about, well, I think about that end, that amazing ending line in the mirror stage, right? Where the point that the analysis wants to bring the subject to, right, is an ecstatic limit, right? And to open onto a new type of capacity for self-determination that exceeds and frees you from all these previous, well, and he uses the religious language, like those thou art that. And so I don't necessarily
Yeah.
know if I'm saying that the state of the mystic, whether in the moment of sort of acute and more florid sort of experience, but more as just a way of being, as something involving a practice or an orientation of openness and receptivity, but also of a kind of transformed agency, is quite the same as, the vexing question of whatever Lacan means by like traversing the fantasy. But it does seem to involve a kind of commitment to both understanding the self, but then transcending the self as a project and like a vocation or a call that
Yeah.
fundamentally, and I think at its best, results in transformations of how you relate to other people in the world. And on that level, which may be a mystical vision of psychoanalysis, I did feel this kind of sympathy, and this may just be my personal sort of disposition, like finding myself sympathizing with what you see in these mystics, but also what I think these mystics may be doing in their own lives, and what I treasure in psychoanalysis, or what I treasure as being a potential of psychoanalysis.
No, I completely agree. I mean, that's a really good answer to a way of thinking through, what I've been up to in the book and the task of psychoanalysis. So I just endorse that. It is a cure through love. Who says that? Is it Freud or Jung? Who
It's
says that?
Lowald, actually,
Lowald.
right? It was just such a
Is it Lowald?
Yeah, it's a neglected
Wow.
figure, and is also one of those people who's like, I'm very explicitly like, I'm not a Nazi. But I can't disavow my teacher who was Heidegger, and so this produces like essentially a psychoanalysis as a pedagogy of love, and it's it is distinctively Neoplatonic, but it's also. And Lowell is I think neglected by a lot of people, and he hasn't read that much these days. But it is with I guess the singular exception of our friend Ben Fong, who we've had on, and I want to credit for being a very good Lowell scholar.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of rawness and a combination of both the intellectual capacity and the this sort of personal kind of resilience or survival of historical traumas and disruptions, not the plague, but here World War II and all these other sort of sunderings and losses, with this sort of commitment to keep on showing up for whatever is weird and strange and different and other in the self, in the analyst, and just in the world. And it's both erudite, but also I think emotionally, affectively and autobiographically charged. And so I don't know, this was part of the way in which I appreciated the model that you produced.
No, it's just great. I mean, if psychoanalysis is a pedagogy of love, then it has, all sort of thousands of echoes with mysticism, as I understand it. Yeah, the two things are completely aligned. And I guess what's interested me more over the years in psychoanalysis is the clinical side. People. I get students every year who say, "Oh, I'm interested in psychoanalysis. So, what do you mean?" And I say, "Oh, well, I read Zizek." Say, well, he's not a psychoanalyst. And if you throw a rock out of this, don't throw a rock out of the window on 16th Street. But if you did, you could hit a practicing psychoanalyst who could actually tell you how this operates in practice. And that side to Freud is very important, and to Lacan is very important. So yeah, and the idea of attention, free floating attention, as in clinical practice as being very close to forms of mystical attention. I think that's very, very strong. And I think also you could reconfigure the whole Lacanian, triad of imaginary. So the imaginary is the enclosure in the ego, is that Hamletized doubt that I was talking about, melancholy, which has the illusion of freedom as well, the symbolic and the real. And obviously mysticism comes up in Lacan, in Seminar 20, isn't it? With the encore, where he's talking about Therese Rabelais and Hardewig of Antwerp and the experience of the erotic there. He's onto that. He could have said a lot more, I think, but he's onto something there. So there is a sense in which what psychoanalysis is trying to push through to is very close to what mysticism is trying to push through to, and there are many, many echoes back and forth. So yeah, no, I agree with that. The Acropolis story is fascinating, isn't it? And that's a kind of disturbance of memory, a kind of figure of having gone beyond the father, and the feeling of irreality that he has in that moment. Yeah, I've had that on the Acropolis. I mean, as a kind of reenactment of Freud's experience. But so I think in that sense, going back to Abby's question about things like the ascetic, the oblique, the autobiographical, all of that, there are all these psychoanalytic echoes, and obviously the nutrition for the mystic, the kind of the food that they're working from is jouissance, is a kind of enjoyment, which is sensuous, but that mustn't just be libidinally expressed, which is, a problem with Lacan when he looks at the picture of the statue of Therese Rabelais and says, so she's coming. He says, well, no, actually, no, her heart's being pierced by the rays of God. Slightly different. So there's a sublimation in that. And there's also, for me, an asceticism which is essential to eroticism, right? So the ascetic, the erotic, and the ascetic have to be linked together. And we've got very bad at that. We tend to, see the erotic in much more, crude terms, and then the ascetic in much more kind of ethereal terms. And what a text like the Song of Songs is doing for mystics is combining the two, and bringing the two to bear on each other. So and this is why, plow my vagina, my love, is not the right response. And your belly is like a stack of wheat, and your hair is like goats streaming down Mount Gilead, is a more felicitous response. So I think we struggle with that, and we struggle with the meanings that asceticism has developed in our culture, dieting, juice detox, and so on and so forth. But I think that we could do this again. There's all sorts of echoes on, the relationship of, you mentioned Lurvald, who I read after I came to New York 20 odd years ago. I stumbled on a kind of conclave of Lurvaldians, and they showed me texts, and I was quite struck by them. And there is that different path through, and Binswanger and Boss and these people. And but also to make another plea for Lang. I mean, my introduction to phenomenology was, I had one teacher, two teachers, but then I discovered the Langians in London when I was very young, because they were using existentialism, as they called it, to do therapeutic work with mixed effects. But Lang was giving it a go and was dealing with people that, were in mystic states. It's just that they've been incarcerated because they're in those mystic states. They've been locked up. So that's also, where are the mystics now? Well, they're on the street, and we don't want to listen to them. And that says a lot about our capacity to hear.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
Come back anytime.
I'd love to have you. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. You have a standing invitation.
And I think our readers, whatever their psychoanalytic their traditions or dispositions, will find a lot in this book to sort of to send them in lines of flight, to use that other type of vocabulary, but that there's
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
and even to say that there's a whole other episode we could do with you to talk about modernity and sort of its our relation to mysticism in the present and so many other things. But just this was a really fecund and lovely book, and I really enjoyed it. I think we both really enjoyed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
The impact that was a delight, and people always say that we have barely scratched the surface of this.
Are you doing book talks or appearances anytime soon that you want us?
Thankfully, I've finished with that for the present round, but I've got there's a pamphlet I've got out, which I love because they let me get away with it. It's a little group in London called Everyday Analysis. Oh. It's a pamphlet called "Your Life Is Not a Fucking Story," and they said, "What do you want to call it?" And I said, "Well, what about your life is not a story?" I said, "Okay." And I wrote back and said, "What about your life is not a bloody story?" Okay. Okay. So what about your life is not a fucking story? I said, "Okay." So it's going to be out. Your life is not a fucking story. And that's a kind of try to take down narrative ideas of the self.
Okay, well, we will link to that and to the book in the show notes. Thank you so much, Simon. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for listening. Ordinary Unhappiness is made possible and kept completely ad-free by the support of our Patreon community. If you would like to support the ongoing existence of the show and also get 2 additional episodes behind the paywall per month, please head over and find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Simon Critchley. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.